All right, welcome back to the Fundamentals of Philosophy. This is part one of our Module 3 lecture on epistemology, or the study of knowledge. This lecture has a lot of ground to cover, so we'll be moving fast and oversimplifying things a bit. As in Module 2, please consult the accompanying handouts for terminology and specifics. The question of what counts as legitimate knowledge is closely entangled with the question of what counts as a legitimate source of knowledge. As we saw in the previous module, Ignaz Semmelweis was condemned by the very medical establishment that he was trying to save. His data was good, but his findings were dismissed. Semmelweis had facts, but he didn't have what the authorities of his time would accept as knowledge. So how should we distinguish between genuine knowledge and mere belief, between knowing that something is the case and simply thinking that something is the case, to use Jennifer Nagel's terminology from our readings? And who gets to make that distinction? For over 2,000 years, since Plato, philosophers have defined knowledge as justified true belief. You possess genuine knowledge when three conditions have been met. You believe something is true, that's one. That something is true, two. And you have good reasons for believing that it's true. Justified true belief. This framework seems intuitive. And yet all three criteria, the justification, the truth, and the belief, can and have been challenged. Of the three, justification tends to be the most contested. What actually counts as a good reason for a belief? We're going to look at two different paths to answering that question in this lecture. Both paths understand knowledge in terms of foundations. For knowledge to be justified, it needs to come from a trusted source. You can't just get it from anybody off the street. There should be some bedrock of certainty that it rests on, right? The first path is rationalism. Rationalists locate the foundations for truth in logical necessity. Trustworthy ideas should be clear and distinct. They should flow deductively downward from rational first principles before being applied to specific cases. To discover truth, follow reason. Rationalists tend to prefer mathematics, logic, and a priori reasoning that is independent of experience. Empiricists, on the other hand, empiricism takes the path of inductive reasoning. Knowledge comes from experience. We build it experience by experience, observing patterns and noticing which patterns tend to happen most often and most consistently. Specific cases provide the foundations from which we generalize out to universal principles. Scientific investigation, hypothesis testing, and a posteriori reasoning from experience, these are the hallmarks of empiricism. Now, for rationalists, certainty is built into reason itself. It is innate to reason, and we can therefore use reason to arrive at innate ideas that are necessarily true. Think about mathematical proofs. 2 plus 2 seems like it equals 4, regardless of what anyone experiences, right? If no humans existed to count things, 2 plus 2 would still equal 4. For the empiricist, this dynamic is reversed. Mathematical proofs like 2 plus 2 equals 4 are generalizations from our experience of countable objects in the world. That's where we get the idea. And we arrive at this knowledge from the undeniable fact of experience itself, which is as certain as anything can be. Now, the rationalist story begins with Plato. By the writing of the Meno, which is our reading for this module, the distinct philosophical voice of Plato himself is starting to emerge. Socrates at this point should be considered more of a literary device for describing Platonic philosophy. In the dialogue, Socrates is faced with Meno's paradox. How can you search for knowledge if you don't already possess it? The search for knowledge implies that knowledge is lacking, right? But if you don't possess knowledge, then how would you recognize it if you found it? By definition, you don't know what you're looking for. To respond to the paradox, Socrates provides a demonstration. An uneducated slave is shown to be able to arrive at a geometrical proof through minimal prompting. Now, setting aside the normalization of slavery and the class elitism, which are both unfortunately very common in ancient Greece, What this demonstrates is Plato's theory of knowledge as recollection, an early example of the innate ideas hypothesis. The geometrical proofs are already present in our minds, which have acquired them over countless turns on the wheel of reincarnation. We don't learn them from experience. We're not taught them. We recognize them as the structure of our own reasoning. Plato's theory of knowledge as recollection sets the stage, but it's the French philosopher René Descartes who really brings rationalism into focus during the early modern period. And to set the stage for Descartes, he was writing after Galileo had recently been persecuted for heresy by the Catholic Church. So there was this very dangerous tension sort of in the air between the Aristotelian assumptions that were underlying established church doctrine and the emerging mechanistic science that viewed the universe as this precise, deterministic, and predictable form of clockwork, what we talked about in the last module, where every event follows necessarily from prior causes according to strict mathematical laws. Now, Descartes wanted to both preserve the emerging science, he was a scientist as well as philosopher, he wanted to preserve the emerging science from religion, and simultaneously to salvage concepts like free will and the human soul from the deterministic clockwork. He wanted to have both. He also was motivated to save himself from the church. He had a lot of motivations. So Descartes' methodological innovation was to use skepticism as a tool to discover certainty. Contrasted with Socrates' dialectical method, Descartes sets out literally from his armchair to systematically critique every category of belief, searching for any cracks in the conceptual scaffolding. He wielded this method like a wrecking ball, destroying the foundations for any belief that admitted of even the slightest possibility of doubt. What about our senses? Well, they've deceived us too often to be trusted. Think about submerging a straight stick halfway into water. The stick looks bent in the water, right? But we know that the stick is really straight. The bent appearance is an illusion, a deception of the senses. And we've all been fooled at some time or another by dreams that seemed just like waking life at the time. Okay, well, what about arithmetic and geometry? Those seem pretty strong. But Descartes says a powerful enough force, like say a malicious demon with amazing power, these days maybe a malevolent AI, something like this could, in theory, even deceive us about mathematical and geometrical proofs. And so it goes, one by one. Descartes knocks him down until at last one clear and distinct idea remains. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. The very act of doubting confirms the existence of a doubter. This is bedrock for Descartes. If our thoughts can deceive us, then there must be some thinker capable of being deceived. By attempting to doubt this, we prove it necessarily true. And so Descartes discovers his bedrock of certainty, the res cogitans, or thinking substance, by methodologically subtracting everything that has location, mass, or volume, the entire material world, what he calls the res extensa, or the extended substance. Now, Richard Rorty has described this move as the invention of the modern mind. By demolishing everything that is outside of the thinking subject, Descartes invents a separate inner space where all mental events occur. This has become our common sense understanding of the mind. But this wasn't always the case. Before Descartes, the Aristotelian concept of mind involved something like the direct apprehension of the structure of the world. The Aristotelian mind was world-involving. After Descartes, the mind stood outside of the world and observed it. John Dewey calls this the spectator theory of mind. Returning to Jennifer Nagel's terminology, Descartes knows he exists, but he can only think about the external world. He's certain of his internal states. He's certain of those, but he can only form hypotheses about anything outside of them. The thinking substance is severed from the extended substance. We have now entered what Daniel Dennett calls the Cartesian Theater. The Cartesian self is immaterial. It is what remains when material qualities like mass and location have been subtracted. And what this immaterial thinking substance is thinking about is ideas. Ideas play across the screen, the theater of the mind, and the inner, isolated self observes and judges and evaluates them as a sort of ghostly audience trapped in this internal cinema. Now, Descartes' method of radical doubt was hugely influential, but not everyone was convinced. The English philosopher John Locke rejected Descartes' innate ideas hypothesis. You don't get real knowledge about the world by sitting in your armchair and reasoning about logical contradictions. You can't radical doubt yourself into learning how to swim. Knowledge comes from living in a world of experience. Locke thus sets up empiricism as an alternative specifically designed to overturn Cartesian rationalism. Whereas Descartes' world was a rational engine constructed out of Galilean clockwork, the world of Locke is a realm of forces and powers modeled after Newtonian dynamics, where objects impress themselves upon our senses through causal interaction. The mind begins as a blank slate, a tabula rasa, in Locke's terminology, waiting to be inscribed by the blade of experience. So how does that work exactly? How does the world inscribe ideas upon the blank slate of our minds? So according to Locke, objects in the world have what he calls primary qualities. These are things like size, shape, and motion. These belong to the objects themselves, but the objects also possess what he calls secondary qualities that produce sensations in us that show up as ideas like color, taste, and smell. To oversimplify, primary qualities are objective, they're out there in the world. Secondary qualities are subjective, in the head. A brown table really is solid, right? It would be solid even if no one ever encountered it. But it only appears brown under certain conditions and to certain kinds of observers. So genuine knowledge about the world in this system involves determining how well our internal representations correspond to external objects. This is known as the correspondence theory of truth. An idea is true insofar as it resembles its external object. Notice that even as Locke rejects Descartes' innateness hypothesis, he has implicitly smuggled in Descartes' inner theater starting point for the mind. The ghostly Cogito still sits outside of the world watching ideas on an inner screen. Locke just disagrees with Descartes about where the ideas come from. What Locke does give us is a good empiricist story about how the movie gets projected onto the screen of the theater. We don't perceive objects directly. We perceive the ideas that they cause in us. The world projects images onto consciousness through sensation, and the mind reflects on these simple images, shaping them ultimately into all the complex ideas that we will ever have. Now, this idea has been remarkably resilient, considering it's only 400 years old. Centuries later, Bertrand Russell will again consider the illusion of the bent stick in water, and conclude that our inner representation of the world is constructed out of individual atoms of what he calls sense data, atomic units of sensation that combine to paint a world across our minds. We never encounter the real stick, only our representation of it. The brown table is just patches of brown sense data that have been organized into a brown table experience by our mental processing. A veil of perception hangs always between mind and world, and there is no way to ever get to the reality beyond the veil. It was the Irish Bishop George Berkeley who originally pointed out the logical conclusion of Locke's theory. If all we ever know are ideas, and ideas exist only in minds, then the only thing that we can ever know is more ideas. There is no sense of a primary quality that we can possibly have other than an idea of it. In fact, if we try to talk about things that aren't ideas, we quickly lapse into utter nonsense. There isn't anything coherent that we can say about the object that causes the ideas because we will always just be talking about more ideas. We never actually get to the part where our belief in the external object gets justified by the experience of the representation. And if the existence of the external world isn't justified by experience, then there's no need to suppose that an external world exists. It's an unnecessary supposition. Berkeley bites the bullet on this. It's ideas all the way down. Esse est percipi. To be is to be perceived, and nothing besides. This view is sometimes called immaterialism or subjective idealism. And this is where Russell leaves us as well. As isolated immaterial souls, wandering the halls of the Cartesian Theater, while a film of the world, constructed out of ideas, of sensations, of properties, of objects, plays out before us. And we can never get outside of the theater, to the world beyond the screen. Whatever it is that we have knowledge of, it isn't a mind-independent reality. But maybe we can find some cracks in the scaffolding of the theater. What about science, right? We can test things to see if they're real. We might not reach Cartesian certainty, but we can certainly reach a justified inference to the best explanation based on repeated corroboration, acquired via hypothesis testing, all the stuff we talked about in Module 2. Well, in Part 2, we'll see how a Scotsman named David Hume came along and takes even that justification away from us. And I'll see you there.